Hello everyone and welcome to .NET Core Central. In today's video, I am going to talk about basics of C# and mainly focusing on classes and functions. So in C#, whenever we have to write any program, the fundamental composition starts with a class. So any code that we write, it needs to be encapsulated by something called as a class. You can consider class as a placeholder or a container where we write code. But class itself do not have an option to write the code directly inside. Inside of a class, what we need are functions which are ultimately the container of the logic in our application. So for class, the signature of class starts with the keyword class, and then it has an access modifier. Access modifier tells where the class can be accessed from. So access modifier can be internal, it can be public, or it can be private. Now, private class cannot be at the top level, but we can create private class inside of another class. So at this level, we can create a class and we can name it as something like user writer. So this can be a private class which can access only inside of this public class, which is user provider. But we do not use a private class as often as using private with function as an access modifier. So when a class is defined as public, it can be accessed across anywhere this DLL can be used. When we build this project, which is C# basic, it generates a DLL file, a file with .dll extension. Wherever we use this DLL, that particular project or solution can access this user provider class. Whereas if we define this class as an internal class, then it can be used by anyone inside of this project. Meaning from program.cs you can access this particular class, but you cannot access it outside of this DLL or this particular project. But there is a workaround for that, which is basically you can expose your internal classes outside of this assembly or DLL into a different assembly. But you have to specify exactly which assembly can access this internal class. And that is used using a particular assembly directive. It's called internals not exposed to, it's called internals visible to, and this is the namespace, which is it is under runtime system.runtime.compiler services, and here you can specify the name of the assembly where you want to expose this. So it can be like C# basic.unit test. This is a very classic example where you might want to expose an internal class is to your unit test or integration test. And at that point in time, you will use that. This will make this internal class user provider available outside of this assembly. So as I mentioned, public and internal, these are the two main access modifier that can be used with a class at a top level. And public means it can be accessed by any other assembly which can access this. Internal is allowed only within assembly unless you use the assembly directive using internals visible to and then expose this to some other assembly. So now, having said that, the next topic that I wanted to cover is functions. As I mentioned, classes do not have or classes cannot contain logic by itself. Inside of a class, you can just declare variables, which are class level variables and can be accessed within the class. Or if you declare the variables as public, they can be accessed outside of the class itself. But the actual logic always resides in functions. And functions are defined with, first it starts with an access modifier, which can be public, which can be internal, or it can be private, or it can be protected. And we're going to talk about each of these in a few minutes. So let's first start with public. So we can define something as public, and then the function needs to have a return type. Return type is the type of data that the function is going to return. If the function is not returning anything, then it will be declared as void, meaning it is not returning any type. And it can be test, the name of the function. And then inside of this function, you can, because it is not returning anything, we can just do a console.writeLine, let's say. And the functions, or any function, can take one to many parameters. Parameters are again data types that can be passed to the function, which can be used inside of the function for applying business logic. So for example, let's say this function expects an integer called age, and maybe it is, instead of test, let's say it is a search user. So the search user takes age and it wants to search all the user with this age. And then here the age can be used here in logic. Use age to find users, for example. And then we can just use the age to print out here also, just to show how this parameter, which is incoming, can be used inside of a function. Now this $sign is used whenever we have to declare a string, which can use this curly braces, and then inside the curly braces we can use any parameter or variable to do a string interpolation. So this will make the age as a string essentially. And here you can say, so now it is creating a string where age will be converted to string. So it will happen at this point inside of this curly braces, the age will be converted as a string and this will be printed out. So this is a public function, meaning this function can be used outside of this class. But question, how do you do that? So if we have to access this function outside of this class, let's say inside the program.cs, first what we are going to do is, we have created a class which is just a blueprint or the definition of the class. Now you have to instantiate the class to create a new instance of the class, and then you can access the functions inside of the class using that instance or object. So we can declare like var user provider is equal to new user provider, and it needs the namespace. So let's add the namespace. And then you can do user provider dot search user, and let's say age is 20. So this is how you can access a function, specifically a public function, using this syntax. We create an instance of the user provider and then call the search user on it. Now, as I mentioned, here in this case, the search user is a public function, whereas even if the search user is an internal function, it will still be accessible from here. It's because internal functions are accessible within the assembly. But if we make this as private, then this is not accessible anymore. And we can see the error here saying search user is not accessible due to production level. Similarly, if we create it as protected, is the same thing. It cannot be accessed outside. Protected member can be accessed only by subclasses, and we'll get into subclasses in next video. So let's keep it back to public. So search user is public now. And then here we can create a private, let's say integer get user age, and this is string name. And given that we are saying that the return type of this function is an integer, we have to return an integer value. If we do not, the project is not going to compile. And you can see here, we are seeing an error here, which says user provider dot get user age, not all code path returns a value. So we have to return a value here. For that, we can use return, and let's just return 1. So now this is a private function, and this private function cannot be accessed outside using the object as I mentioned earlier. So if you do this and you do get user age, as you can see, it is not accessible, it is not defined. It is saying that it is not accessible due to production level. So let's go ahead and delete this. And this function, which is a private function, can be accessed only inside of this class, meaning we can call it here get user age, and we can give a name. And at this point, this function can be accessed because it's a private function. It is accessible within this class. Now, apart from functions, there is one other thing which is out of box available in all classes, which is called a constructor. By default, every class has a default constructor which does not have any implementation. And when we do a new of the class name, that is when the constructor is invoked. But if we want to do any logic, we can always create a constructor and then we can execute some logic here. Now, one thing I personally do is I keep the constructor very light because you don't want the object creation to take a lot of time. So constructors should be used only for setting variables which can be passed into the constructor through inversion of control or dependency injection. So here, let's say user provider, you want to pass a connection string because ultimately the user provider class would probably be talking to some sort of data store. So if you have a string connection, what you want to do is here, all you want to do is you want to define a class level variable called connection and assign that connection to the incoming connection. That's all you do. Usually that is what the constructor should be used for, and that is what I use it for. Now you can obviously do a lot more thing in constructor, but I do not personally prefer that because that causes the exception handling and all becomes extremely tough if you do it this way, because in a modern application we usually use something called as a dependency injection container and a design pattern called inversion of control. And if you do that, the constructor should be very light. Otherwise, the exception handling becomes complex and it is hard to manage. The code is a little bit harder to manage. Now here at this point, we are getting an error because, as you can see, the default constructor takes a connection string which we are not passing. So one option is, of course, we want to pass connection string, and that's what we should do. The other thing which I do not recommend is to create a default constructor which does not say anything. Well, why I do not recommend this, or why I personally do not like keeping like 2 or 3 constructors, is because then it becomes very hard for a user of this class to understand in which situation which constructor should be used. And that causes some confusion, especially if you are doing application development. If you are using reusable components, which are base components, then there can be an argument that you might need multiple constructors. But when you are an application developer who is building business applications, I do not see a lot of reason to use multiple constructor. And I personally feel it gets really confusing in terms of usage to understand which constructor should be used in which scenario, and so on and so forth. So I personally do not use default constructors along with other constructors. That's just how I do things, my own philosophy. So that's the biggest thing with class, is that class comes with functions, or we create function inside of class. The functions can be private or public or internal or protected. And then you can create a constructor or many constructors. As I mentioned, I prefer only one constructor. And the constructor will be called during the creation of the object of the class. And as I mentioned, class is nothing but a blueprint. When you create a class's object using the new parameter, that's when the class is allocated in the memory. And after that, you can use the functions to execute logic inside of a class. Apart from the functions, there is one other handy feature which is provided by C# programming language, which is not available in other programming language like Java. Is called property. Property is a very easy way for exposing private variables outside of the class. And it is used, the syntax is this: you create a public or private, properties can be private also, or protected or internal property, and you give a property name, for example, connection. And then you can have a get set, where once you set it, this will be the new value. So here you can come and you can say user provider dot connection is equal to some connection. Now I personally do not, I set it as an int, so that's why it was throwing an error there. So if I change it from int to string, now if we go back here, we can see the connection is set. Now I personally do not prefer exposing internal variables as get as well as set. I prefer to only provide get, because with get, what happens, you are just giving immutable data types or immutable data structures, meaning your class is exposing a value which cannot be mutated outside. And now here, because it cannot be set outside and we are not setting it inside, I can just return the connection which was set as a part of the constructor. And now if we go here, this is going to throw an error because it is just a getter. It is read only. So here we cannot set any value, but we of course can do a console dot write line and print out the value of connection, which is nothing but going to be empty or test if we set this as a test, because the constructor value that we are setting here is going to be set in the connection object here, or the connection property here, and which is going to be returned by the connection property here. So these are the fundamental construct of a class. A class can have one or many class level variables. It can have one or many properties, and then one or many functions. Now in terms of Variables also, the variables can be private, public, protected, or internal. The standard practice is to have variables only as private, at max protected, but never public. If you want to expose something at public, as I mentioned, just to keep your class immutable, you can expose it through property and only through a getter. And then you have functions which can be used to implement business logic inside of your class. And then finally, a class can be accessed, creating an instance of the class, and then calling different function. So that is the fundamental of a class, and that is all I wanted to cover for today's video. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you are new to my channel and if you think you are getting value out of my channel, please subscribe to my channel. And thanks so much for watching this video.